Welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert in Washington, D.C. with your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz. Talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now, your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Hello and welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, the Executive Director of the LCRL, and today we're going to be talking about the clash of worldviews. It continues in our culture, and free speech, religious liberty, and civility are the cultural casualties. We're going to look a little bit at the week in review and see the things that are going on. We're here in the Capitol right now, and the impeachment trial, and all this talk of unity is completely out the window in a lot of different ways, especially when we see some of the executive orders that have come down from President Biden and his new administration. In fact, one of the big beefs they had with President Trump is he did, these executive orders. It's just interesting. The executive orders he did actually generally empowered average people, businesses, deregulation, things like that. The executive orders from President Biden are exactly the opposite. They're empowering government's reach back into your life. You should always look at the results. Don't listen to the way things are talked about. Ask yourself who's empowered, who's not empowered, and then make decisions based there. But yeah, it's crazy here in D.C. I got to tell you, it's surreal to see the Capitol behind 11-foot fence with barbed wire and to still see the National Guard here. It's surreal. And the day of the March for Life, like I talked about last week, to see that kind of force being projected outward onto average folks. It was basically saying the Capitol is not your place. It's the place of the politicians, and in reality, that's never been true. There are times that people, like I've said before, there are times that people have been in the Capitol that I disagree with vehemently, and there were some terrible kind of protests. They were loud and raucous, and sometimes they even breached the chamber. But it was, again, pushing back on that, I have no problem with it. There's no reason that people need to advocate violence just to get their viewpoint across when their viewpoint is being well heard. But it is interesting to see this force that's here in the Capitol, and I think it's way overblown, but it is terrifying in one sense because the pictures remind you of something like East Germany, and so I don't know what the solution. I hear they're going to be here through March, so we'll see. So today we're going to talk again. We're going to go back again and talk about some fundamental things, because in order to understand a lot of things, or at least have I think a healthy viewpoint that ultimately allows you to be a good citizen, but to keep fulfilling your mission as a Christian in this world, because that's what it's all about. Even our work in D.C. is not to have our church be more political. It's just to make sure that the church can be free to proclaim the good news of the whole counsel of God. That's law and gospel, because they're both God's word. And so again, is there American worldview? We're going to talk about it. Is it a secular worldview, or is it Judeo-Christian, or has it always been, kind of those two things in tension? Well, again, if you read the Federalist Papers, the Judeo-Christian worldview undergirds the founding of this country, but there's always been an Enlightenment bug, and I would actually say the worst bug is the secularist bug that is determined to say, no, it's our country, and that's kind of what the worldview collisions are all about today. Now, are all worldviews created equal? We're going to talk about that today as well. And does it really matter? Can you have a Judeo-Christian worldview and not be a Christian? You're going to find out, interestingly enough, yeah, that's true, because the Christian worldview is ultimately about the gospel. But the view of morality, the Ten Commandments, there are a lot of cultures that share that. There's other religions that share that. They have a different view of salvation, but they don't, they don't. They see the same thing that a lot of people see in their own consciences, even in their own religious writings. So obviously the Christian worldview is more than the morality that's written, into God's creation. It's about the salvation of that broken creation. And so we're going to have to learn to ask underlying questions, like we've always talked about. What kind of question is a cultural question or is a political question? It's not a what would Jesus do type of question. It's what would the Father have us do, the one who created and ordered the world. And of course, he sent his son to save it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Thank you again for all of you who support us. You can go to our website, lcrlfreedom.org. That's lcrlfreedom.org. You can see our Facebook page there. You can also see all of our resources, our mom and pop resources, our Champions for Liberty events, and also if you feel so inclined, you can see a place where you can donate to our work here. We are here because of you. We're in nobody's budget. We're here because folks who listen to us and folks who use our resources keep supporting us, and we're very thankful that you do. All right, so things are starting to heat up on the Hill, and I don't think the fire is really good right now. I think it's kind of it's a burning fire that's designed to even create more chaos. Abortion is now being shoved down the culture's throat in ways. In the next year or two, I just hope some of it can be thwarted. I hope there are moderate Democrats who just say this is too much. We'll see. And I hope these Republicans who say they actually believe in some of these things actually stand for them when the time is right. They're going to be probably a lot more bold now because they're the minority. I wish when they were the majority they would be as bold, but we'll see. The sexual orientation, gender identity laws are being federalized, and we're going to talk about that today. That is a bad, bad thing. And it's not just that they're being federalized. Even the things that we share in common, the physiological truths that are basically that we're born into, all those things are being swept away. And so now we're going to have this notion that the individual person is the sole authority of their life, as if there's no morality, no ethics, no common culture, no nothing that bonds us together besides that. That is a recipe for absolute chaos. And that's kind of where we're going with some of this stuff. But the worst thing is that the church is in the crosshairs of this. The church as a moral institution is in the crosshairs of this, because if the church stops speaking the moral voice of God, then its saving voice will never be heard either. But that's what really that's what's really going on. Now, I'm going to be sitting in a lot of meetings in the next couple of weeks that are going to be talking about some of the issues. The Equality Act, I just was in one today, and it just drives me crazy that people did not take this more seriously before the election. We were told the election was about a nice guy versus a really evil guy. No, it was about the Equality Act versus individual liberty. That was what this last election was. And if it was a lesser of two evils, I would take individual liberty every time and then try to tell people how to live it virtuously for the sake of others. But the Equality Act is the government literally taking over every aspect of your life and even telling you what kind of morality, what kind of ethics, what kind of virtue. They're going to tell you what male and female doesn't mean anymore. They're going to impose all kinds of things on you. And because the federal government is putting this into law, the religious the Restoration of Religious Liberty Act, that was meant to protect the First Amendment, and they're going to do away with that in the Equality Act. Can you imagine? Religious liberty gone because of the Equality Act. Can you imagine if you're a traditional Christian church, you're going to be litigated out of business? And there were Christians who voted for that. I don't understand that. I never thought that government. I didn't put my faith in Donald Trump. I didn't put my faith in President Biden. I don't put my faith in President Obama because I don't put my faith there. My faith is in Jesus Christ. But bad government can destroy even the ability to share that good faith. And people voted for that this time, because if all this stuff does go through, and right now it doesn't look like there's any headwinds to it because the media is not going to report on what's actually being done, those Christians who voted for this platform, this secular progressive platform, you literally voted to make your faith and your church illegal. I just don't understand that. I just don't understand that. So I think Christians have been kind of bullied into this when they finally do know what's going on. I even hear Christians talking about civility. That's the real issue. We need to talk about civility. And look, I have no problem with issues of civility. I think, obviously we want a humane society and a civil society. But what's interesting to me is that the people who are writing these things like the Equality Act and the Fairness Act, which is a state law in Virginia, they use all kinds of nice sounding words, but those are some of the most brutally uncivil legislation processes that are going to ever be unleashed on our culture. And so again, you're going to have to get you're going to have to push behind that, because it's not about civility. The very people that are using the word civility are the ones that are hammering away. So I get the civility discussion. I get the let's be Christ-like in who we are, and that's true. But in that spirit, we must proclaim the Father's creating and ordering of the world. That's our first voice in culture. And, that calls our culture to account. It calls our culture back to God. It calls our culture to repentance. It calls our culture to being humane and civil. And that's the one thing that people are trying to litigate out of the public square. So, again, this is not our discussions. We're not trying to be more political. In fact, we're trying to do anything but that. We're just trying to keep the First Amendment protections in place so the church can preach and teach the whole counsel of God publicly without fear. And so that is not a WWJD question. That's a WWFD. What would the Father have me do? Or what would Jesus really do? He would tell you to do whatever the Father says. And of course, he fulfills the Father's will on your behalf for your own salvation. So, all right, let's get back to some foundational things, because going forward, we've got to start asking the right questions. We've got to start, being more critical of what's being said out there, because I think in some ways even our own words are used against us. Because they don't mean the same thing. So when someone even talks about justice or social justice or something like that, yeah, there's a biblical view of some of those things. But the very people that are propagating that notion and politicizing that notion don't mean anything like that to you. They actually don't believe in objective truth. They don't believe in moral truth. They don't even believe in things like love and mercy and forgiveness, because those are all words used by powerful people to empower themselves. They only believe in power. And so then what does the word justice mean if it just means I get to be in power? No, that's not what the word justice means. So then don't let them take that word and use it against you. And that's a lot of what's happening today in a lot of the discussions, because Christians think we're using the same words, and we're not. There's two worldviews. There's two competing worldviews. There's one worldview that's seeking to kind of, I hear even President Biden say we need to live up to our ideals. I agree with that. But then you can't trash our ideals. And that's what the flag thing is. It's about trashing our ideals. Well, either our ideals are worth living up to, which Martin Luther King said, or they're not. And again, when you look at these ideals, yes, they're worthy of us living up to them. They're worthy of us saluting them, even if we haven't always lived up to them in the past. So again, the whole destruction of the structures in our ideals, we're against that. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't be talking about living up to something and then tearing it down at the same time. So again, when we look at this, there are worldviews in conflict. And I think in order to get to these discussions, you got to get to the more fundamental discussions. And that most of the discussions today are on the superficial level. That's one of the reasons why when we talked about Black Lives Matter, we said, what is their platform? They're using the notion of civil rights. They're hiding behind that because they're technically more than a civil rights organization for poor black folks. It's a lesbian organization, a sexual orientation organization, an LGBT organization. It doesn't believe in the traditional family. It believes in the government takeover of all these things, and it believes in flattening sexuality into an egalitarian mush. And it's using civil rights language to drive that agenda. And so we've talked about the honest, discussion about the defund police movement and the family and the issues in the urban community. We've talked about all those different kind of things, and I think in a fair and an open, honest way. And again, what we're running into is the superficial level of this, as if having a different solution than they do means that we don't take the question seriously, and that's just wrong. It's wrong. There are worldviews in conflict, and the discussions are not illuminating those differences. They're actually muddling that water. And I think we've got to clarify. If we're going to be helpful in the culture, we've got to clarify. What do you mean by that? What is your solution? How come your solution is not to empower the family? How come your solution is not to empower parents and giving them equal access to good education? How come you throw those solutions out? And all you do is, empower a big bureaucracy to actually start to dictate your worldviews on other people. Why can't I disagree with that and still actually be talking about solving the problem that we're talking about? There are worldviews in conflict, and one worldview has weaponized the political discussion so that the other side doesn't dialogue, doesn't even win the election or lose the election. It gets put out of business. And for those of you who disagree with me, then explain to me how every major city in our country today is run by one ideology. And it's crazy, too, because that ideology is not blessing the people who live in the city. And so you just look at this and you go, why? Why wouldn't we actually say, let's do something else? Let's work on empowering families. Let's work on giving educational freedom. Let's work on giving people the skills so that they can help themselves and they don't need us. And again, when people help themselves, it's not to be selfish. It's so that they even have a way to give from the things that God has given them. Why can't we talk about that way of doing things? Because that actually is the more constitutional free citizen way of doing things. And we're the first culture in the world that's tried this. And again, when people say, well, you're overstating it, I just go back to Robert Reich's quote, and it's the quote that undergirds all the discussions between the two worldviews. The secular, progressive, pietistic worldview that's out there today that accepts things almost by faith, not even by science. They claim to be science, but there's so many things, even like in the sexual orientation issue. Science says that you're XX and XY, and how you relate to that is something that we can talk about psychologically. We can talk about it from your experiences, but your body is physiologically one or the other. And that's what's fundamental undergirding all of our ability to have a commonality as human beings and to be able to differentiate ourselves without saying one side is more equal than the other. But that's a biblical worldview. That's a God created us male and female worldview. And the folks who are anti-science and anti-biblical worldview say, no, we're just going to create a whole different way of doing things, and we're going to politically impose it on you. Well, Robert Reich said that's the battle. The battle's between the modernists, and he would be proud of that term, even though it's really not a very pride-worthy term today, and the pre-moderns, and that's, of course, all Christians, especially Bible-believing Christians. He says terrorists will disrupt and destroy lives, but it's not the greatest danger we face. The greatest danger is the church. Wow. And so even things like, Robert Reich would disagree with the trinity of American exceptionalism or the principles that make us who we are. E pluribus unum. Liberty, not equality of outcomes, equality of access, equality of opportunity, and then the ability to use your unique skills and abilities and work ethic and all that to do things that in other places you wouldn't even be given the opportunity to do. And then the final third leg of the uniqueness of the American experiment is in God we trust. Because all of your rights, all of your abilities, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are all about the dignity that comes to you because you're created by God. To people like Reich, that's worth defeating, and this is war. And we've got to expunge that from the public realm. So, wow. We're not the ones who declared that. I mean, we can talk all day long. If you're a secularist, you want to talk about it, we can talk about, what are you going to root these fundamental truths about your dignity and the purpose of life? Because, the Darwinists are telling us there is no purpose in life. Everything's just purposeless. Well, if everything's purposeless and there's no truth, then what is justice? What is mercy? What is peace? What is any of this stuff? Well, Nietzsche told us what it was. It was whoever had the gun. That's what Nietzsche said, which is one of the reasons why the secularists want to take the Second Amendment away from you, too, because they sure don't want you to be able to control your destiny. But the Second Amendment was merely to protect your ability to live a virtuous life constitutionally so that you could actually do what God wanted you to do. And that's where your religious faith was. And that was never to be the government's role. But the government wasn't supposed to have such a huge role in our lives. So this is what we're doing. This is what we're dealing with. And all we're trying to do is push that governmental coercion back in its proper place so we can live as free citizens and try to solve some of these problems in community and in serving one another and in caring for one another and putting aside some of the rights and privileges we have when we can help one another. And that's never going to be done well by some big federal bureaucracy coercing certain people one direction and other people in another. Now, if we step back, we got to remind ourselves about what we're ultimately trying to do. Like I said, we're trying to just keep this political stuff at bay so we can get about the mission of the church freely so everyone can hear about that. We may not have that opportunity in the coming years. That doesn't mean we're going to stop. It may be harder and harder and more punitive to be Christian. I wish it weren't going to be true. I can already see some of those clouds on the horizon. But, again, when we talk about the Christian worldview, there are benefits to even proclaiming that for the sake of the culture, as well as calling the culture to repentance. And so when you think about the Christian worldview, that there's a personal God, that means that there's morals and ethics that hold us all accountable. Our biology is not just in the test tube level of things, is that all this is created and ordered by a God who actually says there's providence and there's purpose in your life. All of that's being stripped out of us in this kind of secularism of the new biology that's out there. Psychology is that there's mind, body, and spirit. And sin is the real problem. And so even if you want to talk about structural sin, it's not the most important thing, because structural sin implies that there's a structural solution to structural sin. Ultimately, there's still sinners in charge of all structures. And when they actually, encase it in a structure, yeah, that's one thing, we can deal with that. But again, when you start talking about solutions, the solution is a changed heart, and that doesn't come through politics, and it doesn't come through coercion. Coercion in politics just keeps the worst tendencies at bay. That's if it's good politics. Ethics, that there are absolutes. Sociology, there's a traditional home, the church, and the state is the least important of those three God-ordained institutions. Law, there's biblical and natural law, but political law has to have its roots in natural and biblical law, or it cannot be just. So when you start having laws that actually violate the Ten Commandments, not in the letter and in the spirit, there's no way it can be a good law, a just law, and it's never going to create a civil and humane society. Politics, justice, freedom, and order, there is a difference between the animal and human kingdoms. But again, see, Darwin says, no, there's not. And so does Nietzsche. Economics, there's the stewardship of life and property, and then there's real history. History's going towards a real purposeful end. And so when you see a lot of these things, there are biblical foundations to a lot of these things. And that's, one of the things that I've got a paper that I'm going to post that talks about how so many of the kind of constitutional things that we honor and cherish and hold dear, they're rooted in some of these very biblical notions of things, and especially the biblical notion of God's providence and the biblical notion that God holds all these things accountable. So, again, if you trash that and suddenly dismiss that, it's not that these things just go away. It's that something else comes in its place. and it's not going to be able to do the same thing. So, again, I talked about a belief in God and His providence. That's fundamental to constitutional law. Belief and respect for revealed religion. That's why it's in the First Amendment. A belief that man is not a perfect or perfectible being, and that government theories must take that into account, because the government's not going to solve those things. A belief that human law must correspond to divine law and the law of nature. Human laws which contradict God's higher laws are invalid. Non-binding are to be resisted. And so again, we see that just being set aside today. So again, when we talk about this, our goal right now is to fight for the liberty to proclaim the whole counsel of God, and to be able to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. And that presupposes contending for the moral truths of the Bible in society as a whole. So I'll post that some of these things that are constitutional principles derived or compatible with the scriptures. And again, I'm not saying that makes America, in its fundamental form, a Christian nation, because ultimately the Christian message is not moralistic. It's the proclamation of the good news of the gospel that Jesus Christ has literally earned our salvation by fulfilling God's law in our place, taking upon himself the punishment that our sins rightfully deserve, and then offers us God's gift of life and life eternal as a gift. So again, but there is a Judeo-Christian moral perspective of law, and there are other religions and even some secular people who share those moral truths with us. And we can honor those things, and those things can be the things that bind us as a culture, even if not everyone is a Christian. Now, what's competing against this, and what's now involved in almost every aspect of our life, is not just Western liberalism, because liberalism and conservatism have always believed in these fundamental, truths. Now there's a Western secularism that is, it's an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, but it's almost embarrassed by any traditional Christian roots. And what's irritating is that in their mind, they are the true supremacists. And it really bugs me today when I hear this talk about supremacy. Yeah, there was a white version of supremacy back at the turn of the last century, and it was all secular in nature. It was Darwinian. It was Huxley. It was people saying that there is no religious restraints on humanity. We're now the survival of the fittest, that we're the species that's advanced beyond all others. And they're the ones who started looking at us and saying, if you look more like an animal, you're a subspecies, or if you look more like this, you're one of the elites. They're the ones who created these notions of supremacy. We fought this from the very word one. And this notion that there's some species that are higher than others, as if the Darwinian stuff is actually true. Well, then you got, Nietzsche comes in and says, yeah, he wipes out truth completely too. If you really believe in survival of the fittest, there is no truth. There's just whoever has the most power. So, all is matter. We're the creators of our own destiny. There is no sin, because we're beyond good and evil. There's only bad structure, and we just gotta, it's okay to create chaos, because it doesn't matter anyway. There is no purpose in life. So we're radically libertine, relationally, sexually, societally, and you just better get used to it. No. And if you want to live that way, that's your choice, but we're not going to codify that in a whole new structure that's going to take away our freedoms and our liberties to be people who are faithful to God and service to each other. So are the worldviews colliding in America today? And the answer to that is yes. Are they all created equal? Well, you better dig deep and ask the fundamental questions. Don't just look at the bumper sticker, coexist. Don't just ask what you're talking about when you say coexist. What if we flatten all existence into some egalitarian, sinful mush? Is that going to be better for us? Either we have a providential dignity mixed with our real depravity, or there is no God, and we're left to be people of mere politics and power. Which one is it? Well, those are the two choices. This last election, I just got so tired of, especially the Hollywood people crying for kindness, love, community, and out of the most libertine, foul-mouthed, pampered, power-seeking people in the country. What I learned when I lived on the coast, and I still actually work on the coast, is once they have their, $3 or $4 or $5 or $10 million beach house, then they become environmental because they don't want you building next to them, and they sure don't want you having free access to the beaches that they now own. So suddenly the turtles need protection from people like you. So I've seen that happen so many times I can't tell you. But again, I'm just saying, if we're going to have this discussion even about civility and honor and unity, well then, physician, heal thyself in a lot of ways. And the good news is there are people who love religious liberty, life, marriage, and education, and that these things are shared by lots of people. And I saw the New York Times is trying to create this notion that white supremacy and intolerance is a Christian thing. And we've got to fight that back, because it's the early supremacists who happened to be white. They were all secularists. That's why Planned Parenthood is so egregious, and African Americans should be absolutely, Black Americans should hate Planned Parenthood. It was designed to wipe you out as people. And it was Margaret Sanger, who was a supremacist, and she loved the KKK. And Woodrow Wilson loved the KKK, and he wanted to pack the court with secularists. And this notion that Christian people somehow were the ones who created all this nonsense. No, we've always fought those things back. Not always very well, maybe, but those have never been indigenous to our way of thinking, but they are fundamental to the secular way of thinking about things. Survival of the fittest is fundamentally the foundation of all supremacy talk. And so today, supremacy, they're bashing the white versus the multicultural, but they're still supremacists worldviews, and they will annihilate those who disagree. So, again, when we talk about this, can you have a Judeo-Christian worldview and not be Christian? Yes, because the gospel, first of all, is beyond politics. And it has nothing. Jesus never told Caesar what to do or what not to do insofar as his work as a proclaimer of the gospel. Caesar, that was not his job at all. So give to Caesar what is Caesar's and nothing more. And then give to God what is God's, and differentiate those. That's why the separation or differentiation of church and state is a Judeo-Christian worldview. Well, at least actually it's a Christian worldview, because there was a theocracy in the Old Testament. So is the Christian worldview, can it be held by those who are not Christian? Yes, because God's law, his ordering of the world, is not only written in the Bible, it's written in every human heart. So let's close with some reflections on what to do as we get involved in all these discussions. And we're going to talk about a lot of these discussions in the days to come, whether it's intersectionality or the social justice movement or racial politics or any of these kind of things. We'll talk about these things. And again, we'll try to give you a two-kingdom perspective on this stuff, so we can be a helpful voice to the solutions as well. So, two kingdom questions behind the cultural issues and policies. The first one is up front. Do you really care about your neighbor? No matter who they are, no matter what they think. Yeah. Then the next question is, well, does God care about your neighbor? And the answer to that is he cares about your neighbor way more than you do. So then why wouldn't God's laws and God's ordering of the world be just as beneficial to your neighbor as to you? Now, there may be a problem that we just tend to preach it, as if and not try to contextualize it to people or try to translate it to people, because people just think that, maybe you're arrogant because you think you're right and everybody else is wrong. When they find out that you're just as convicted by this law as they are, maybe that changes things. We might get in the way of a healthy proclamation of that because we're broken sinners too. I get that. But we also, I think, are confused. Sometimes when we actually do a really good job of sharing God's ordering of the world, talking about why, marriage is so unique because it's built on the physiology of male and female and child, and why a healthy culture needs to be built on that as a unique relationship. It doesn't demean or diminish others, but it doesn't egalitarianize them as if they're all the same. They're not. But when people who hear some of God's law, their initial reaction, we sometimes think once they hear God's law, they'll just go, oh, that sounds great. Well, we should know better than that, because our hearts rebel against God's law too. And there's times when, remember back in the time when you first heard some of the God's law that you didn't know, and it rubbed you wrong because you were happy with the sin that you were committing, and you didn't want to struggle with that. the first response is usually rebellion, not acceptance. And so we can start beating ourselves up because people don't, admire God's law in their lives. Well, that's not our part. That's the fault that we're all sinful people. But then let's not diminish God's law. Let's keep trying to explain it, keep trying to proclaim it, keep trying to tell people He's the one who created us, He's the one who ordered us, and He's the one who redeemed us. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you are unwilling to speak God's law, His ordering of the world, if you won't say that publicly, well, there's no way the gospel can be heard either, because then people, well, like, what do I need the gospel for? I'm not in any way broken. I'm not in any way sinful. I'm not in any way disordered. And so, again, if we're not going to say it at all, and voting for a platform that was going to put the Equality Act into federal law was voting for a platform that said we're going to actually make the public proclamations of the Scripture illegal in America when it's all said and done. And I just can't see why a Christian would have voted for that. So if God really cares about your neighbor more than you, and His laws and His ordering of the world are going to be just as beneficial to others as they are to you, why aren't you trying to proclaim God's ordering of the world for the sake of the culture and for the sake of the church? That's the question you have to answer in your own heart. And it's going to be more punitive to do this. I get it, but we have to keep doing it. So if a culture or a political policy denies and defies basic biblical morality, it can't be a just policy. So the real question then is, are we willing to ask the hard questions that get to the fundamental teachings that undergird a lot of these movements? And the secular progressive that's rooted in kind of a Marxist view of all this stuff, the key is that it's secular, progressive, and it's statist. And it's supposed to replace the church as being fundamental to our hearts and minds. It's supposed to replace the church in terms of how, what's good for our souls, even if I don't even know if they talk about a soul anymore. So are you willing to ask the hard questions that call us all to account? And that should be part of the discussion you have about policy or about culture, about any of these things. Because it's really about you trying to be useful in God's hands and be a blessing to somebody, saying this is God's word, and I hope and pray you hear it from a humble perspective, because I'm just as sinful as you are, but it's His word nonetheless. And then are we willing to look at solutions and ask, do these really help who I'm claiming to help, or do they actually make their lives worse, but they make us feel better? And folks, for all the data on something like, I'll give you something, it's not trivial because it's going to be a big policy thing, but it's another way where people hide behind stuff. The minimum wage. People say, oh, minimum wage, it helps the poor. It helps some poor, and it literally drives other poor out of business. It drives poor businessmen out of business. It drives some poor folks from the market at all, because it makes their jobs superfluous, because suddenly it adds a burden to a business where they can't actually pay that burden. And so they actually either automate or they look for other ways for people to fulfill that, because if you suddenly just raise the rate, if McDonald's is paying $15 an hour, then either the hamburgers got to go up, or there's a sense where there's going to be more automation, less jobs. Even the latest thing I saw on CBO was that 1.4 million jobs. Those are poor people's jobs are going out of business. And people who I know who own businesses who are not wealthy but middle or lower middle class, a lot of those guys will have to either sell their businesses to finally get out of it and lose their opportunity to dictate their lives, or they'll have to work with less people. And it just makes their job harder and harder and harder to do. And the cost of living goes up. And here's the dirty secret. A lot of people will get a raise that didn't deserve to get a raise. People are making plenty of money, but since they're on hourly, their stuff will get bumped up. And so if I was to say you're voting for a law that's going to give you a raise and you're going to blame, or then you're going to say it helps poor people, but it doesn't, why should you feel good about that? Why should you feel like that's a good policy? It makes you feel good, but it doesn't actually help. And so again, Thomas Sowell read Thomas Sowell's stuff on this. He was a Marxist. And then he started looking into the data of this. Well, it should be fundamental that the best thing to do would be able to work, and the best thing to do would be able to increase our skills, and the best thing to do would not to be on the lowest rung, as if that's the place where we're going to start and end our lives. The best thing would be, how can we get past all that? And again, there's all kinds of discussions that ask those fundamental questions. work is something that is not just something that should be eschewed so that we can live libertine lives. Work is part of our DNA of what it means to be human, so that even when we make money, we have something to give to others who are less fortunate, so that they can help themselves and then eventually earn their own keep so they can give to other people. That's the Christian view of things. At the end of the day, have we honored God's work, his preserving work, which is related to his moral ordering of the world, as well as his saving work? So give to Caesar what is Caesar's means no more, no less. Honor, yes, but limitations, yes. Keep Caesar in his place. Giving Caesar control over all of our lives is the foundation to tyranny. And again, we live in a culture that actually has given us untold freedoms as citizens. In fact, we are technically the Caesars, supposedly, in a constitutional republic. But once government has you where it wishes, I just look at history. Look at the secular century, which was last century. It doesn't give you what you want, even what you need. It gives you what it wants, period. So give to God what is God's. Yeah, honor, but also faith, which is even more. So there's no limitations when you give to God what is God's, because God is love, God is mercy, God is just, God is peace, he is truth, and let God have his way with you. Know his truth, trust his truth, rely on his word, be willing to share the whole counsel. And then, as I said, trusting in God differentiates the role of Caesar and the role of God in our lives. And that's one of the reasons why we got to fight to put Caesar back in his proper place. Our gaze has to shift. When it comes to the big issues of life, it has to shift away from Caesar, even away from ourselves, because the solution is faith towards God and fervent love, God's love toward neighbor. So even an outward version of that differentiation that honors God's ordering of the world can create a humane civilization and draw all people towards freedom and liberty. And it is going to demand virtue-seeking practitioners for the sake of others who don't misuse their freedom. And we'll talk about that more in the weeks to come. So again, thanks for your prayers. Thanks for your support. Thanks for tuning in today. Till we see him face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great day.